Recently, Patricia Brazel wrote in PMLA, quote, "Composition studies concentrates on students, not texts. We in this field want to know who our students are. What abilities to use language do they bring to the academy? What new kinds of intellectual work are they able to do? What challenges does academic discourse pose for them?" End quote. Brazel is one scholar among many in the field of composition, rhetoric, and literacy studies who contends that our field was established a student-centered focus long ago in response to socio-cultural changes and the needs of our students. This presentation contends that we must accept student veterans' self-sponsored multimodal composing practices and productions, many of which are about traumatic experiences, as a legitimate focus for research and pedagogy. While Alexis Hart just discussed such practices occurring outside the academy and writing classroom, I contend we must make space for these practices in writing courses. Indeed, Hart and Thompson have argued elsewhere that it may be necessary to reconsider the debate of assigning the personal narrative to accommodate the increase of student veterans returning to college and enrolled in first-year writing. Specifically, Hart and Thompson noted, quote, "Personal narratives promise to make individual stories about war more visible, which fosters the potential to order chaos and make sense of otherwise incomprehensible trauma and tragedy. It also helps create community, not just among veterans, but among non-veterans through the act of drawing civilians into the wreckage of war." End quote. Although Hart and Thompson, like Marilyn Valentino and Galen Leonhardy, admit that assigning the personal narrative can cause alarm and discomfort for professors when students self-disclose, Hart and Thompson have argued that the benefits far outweigh such potential risks, a claim I support. Thus, this presentation more specifically argues about a framework that would legitimize and promote students' self-sponsored, multimodal composing practices, many of which deal with trauma and tragedy as the focus of our composition courses. My research on student veterans' self-sponsored, multimodal composing practices taught me our students have rich lives outside the academy and rich composing practices outside the writing classroom. Aside from the characteristics of the specific student group we're studying or advocating for, the bigger picture shows us how best to work with diverse and vulnerable student populations during these changing times. Within various schools of thought, there are frameworks which legitimate the benefits of narrative composing practices as rhetorical, that is, as making and sharing knowledge through the use of symbol systems. Because of its ability to meet the challenges student veterans face without generating stigma, I chose UDL as a framework for fostering inclusivity and accessibility for students' preferred, or at least self-sponsored, composing practices within writing courses. Stemming from disability studies and sharing some similarities with multimodal composition pedagogy, universal design for learning is an accessible form of pedagogy which evolved from the architectural epistemology of universal design, or UD. UD is defined as, quote, "the design of products to be used to the greatest extent possible by a large population of individuals, regardless of ability," end quote. More specifically, UD has 7 principles for inclusive and accessible design of spaces and products: equitable, flexible, simple, and intuitive use, the provision of perceptible information and tolerance for error, low physical effort in use, and size and space for accessible use. The framework of universal architectural design was appropriated into educational design as universal design for learning. UD's 7 principles are compressed into 3 principles of educational design for accessible and inclusive pedagogy. These 3 principles stress multiplicity and inclusivity for the representation of information, for how students express what they know, and how students can be active learners. Within composition, rhetoric, and disability studies, UDL has been discussed by scholars Patricia Dunn, Jay Dolmage, Melanie Ergo, Cheryl Branker, and Marilyn Valentino, just to name a few. These scholars stress UDL's focus on design as key. Inclusive design ensures that an assignment or curriculum is accessible to the greatest extent possible instead of needing to be quote-unquote retrofitted or in order to quote-unquote accommodate certain students. Again, it's focused on inclusive design in order to reduce barriers student veterans report facing, as well as the stigma attached to needing accommodations and assistance, is why UDL is important for inclusive research and pedagogy for vulnerable and diverse student populations, including but not limited to student veterans. In Hart and Thompson's 2013 white paper, they recommend, quote, to cease focusing on student veterans' deficits, such as TBI, PTSD, and transition adjustment issues, end quote. UDL is a way to avoid focusing on the deficits of our students, regardless of military training. No one needs to self-disclose a weakness because UDL makes room for differences through the design of activities and interactions for all students. Furthermore, as Melanie Ergo testified, quote, having to ask for accommodations as a student is akin to attempting to revise a canvas colored in permanent ink, end quote. In other words, accommodations are inadequate, impossible, and that curricula and practices can and should be designed from the outset to be inclusive and accessible. Bridget, Tanya, Dom, Erica, and Andrew are student veterans who've all taken college writing courses and to varying degrees rely on writing to process and share their traumatic military experiences.
I'm a big fan of language too. Actually, like I start with a lot of times I start with writing and free writing. So free writing actually is a way for me to see patterns in my thoughts and what's going on. So
journaling is also healing for me. Sometimes my barriers to writing creative nonfiction are simple self-pity and desire to avoid painful feelings. So with the daily journaling, I kind of bait and switch myself into confronting those feelings in a way that would be much harder to do if I knew that walking into the moment, the sit down and write moment.
While Andrew alone prefers writing, Bridget, Tanya, Dom, and Erica prefer to process and share their traumatic military experiences through employing their rhetorical prowess as tactile, visual compositionists.
The chaos, and it's everything I've been through since I've been out, and all my thinking, and all the counselors that want to drug you up, and like, here's them wanting you to drug up, this is you healing, and still, because see how there's still some control.
Yeah, it's very controlled. It is. It's very controlled.
You know, and it's about having that control, and it's about living. It's not about drugged up, ignoring it. It's about accepting and living. So I call it chaos.
I love it.
Chaos.
Just started. I don't know that it was ever a decision. It's autobiographical, so if I'm struggling with something, if I'm confused about something, my heart tends to be a way of figuring it out, and a different way of knowing.
My studio all summer long, and then have the show in the fall, yeah. And it got so stressful just trying to work in the studio that finally you made my mentor, advisor, professor was just like, maybe we should work outside. And we could do this whole wall. And at that point I hadn't even spray painted. This was something I just mentioned to her that I like to do. And once I got out there, it was just totally my mind was just in a zone, and people were coming down, and it was way more fun. My friends from the army were coming down there and watching me and hanging out. And I was this is totally the military was, because they're all coming down here hanging out and I'm doing art at the same time.
These students are unique in their own experiences, preferences, and abilities, but they're not as rare as we may think. Indeed, Roger Thompson knows these students well, as he explains in his forthcoming chapter, Recognizing Silence, Composition, Writing, and the Ethical Space for War, and as he explained in his co-authored Writing on the Edge article. But what really gets discussed is the use of students' self-sponsored multimodal composing practices within our writing classrooms. Jody Shipka's work comes closest. Her book-length explanation of mediated activity-based multimodal framework for composing, which I alone argue shares similarities with universal design for learning, provides legitimacy and applicability for translating theory into practice, so that our student compositions can be the focus of our writing courses, so that students can develop and refine their rhetorical abilities and process and share their experiences and knowledge. As Shipka powerfully contends,
as long as there remains a tendency to associate non-lettered forms of representation with the expression of personal feelings, desires, and emotions, rather than with motivated, purposeful, and other-directed attempts at communication, one runs the risk that students and colleagues alike may underestimate, or worse yet, miss entirely the rigorous and, I would add, highly socio-rhetorical aspects of the framework.
my hope is that as teacher scholars of composition, rhetoric, and writing studies, we can come to acknowledge and encourage our students' self-sponsored, multimodal compositions as the focus of our courses. I hope that when students like Tanya, Erica, Bridget, Andrew, and Dom choose to process and share traumatic experiences within the parameters of our assignments, that we do not silence but accept these students as storytellers and as readers with invaluable experiences and abilities that we can learn from in regards to insights on the human condition. Rhetoric, that is the process of making and conveying meaning, regardless of the modality, is characteristic of the human condition, especially in regards to uncertain or inexplicable experiences like trauma and war. Andrew agrees.
I believe that discussing and exploring war in creative writing and in many forms of literature is actually an exploration of the human condition. War is part of the human condition, but for many writers, myself included, and in many pieces of literature, war ends up being a platform for exploring and discussing issues well beyond the limits of what we normally ascribe to that context. So beyond issues of violence and tragedy and loss and trauma, creatively exploring war in literature and in my own writing becomes a way to examine other aspects of life.
While personal, narrative, or expressive composing within the writing classroom is and has long been a topic of debate, such signals the importance of the genre and its place within composition pedagogy. Marilyn Valentino compellingly claimed, quote, "Though we are not trained therapists, we have an ethical obligation to react responsibly," end quote, when students choose to self-disclose in personal writing. But aside from quote-unquote reacting responsibly, we can also react knowledgeably. As experts of composition and rhetoric, we understand the relationship between composing and identity and can provide students opportunities and expertise to explore these connections within writing courses. However, we must remember, as Patricia Dunn most compellingly argued, we each have a preferred mode for making and sharing knowledge. Additionally, in 1971, Janet Emig stressed similar sentiments. She advocated that as teachers of writing, we must remember the differences between school and self-sponsored composing, and though students may show weakness with school-sponsored composing, they may exhibit strength in self-sponsored composing. More recently, English professor and Navy veteran Liam Corley explicitly substantiates this claim in his 2012 college English article, Brave Words, Rehabilitating the Veteran Writer. He admits that poetry has been, for him, crucial for processing his military experiences post-deployment. A thorough review of literature on student veterans and post-secondary education reveals that identity negotiation post-military service, regardless of the level of trauma the individual experienced while serving, is the most pressing issue student veterans face aside from GI Bill benefits. Given composition, rhetoric, and literacy studies scholars' strengths in understanding the role of composing as a means of identity negotiation and as part of the human condition, as the work of Hart and Thompson, Schell, and others in our work has substantiated, we need desperately to find a framework, be it UDL or otherwise, that acknowledges, legitimates, and encourages students' self-sponsored, multimodal composition practices to become the focus of our composition courses. To close, I would like to share several deliverables my research revealed that I consider ripe for practice and further analysis. 1. Not all stories, arguments, or ideas are best conveyed, or even can be conveyed, alphabetically. This is particularly true for traumatic experiences. 2. Writing is part of composing most any work. It is not, however, always the best final product. 3. It's time to put theory into practice through the design of our curricula and assignments to be as inclusive and accessible to all students. 4. Responsivity, the theme of this conference, means concentrating on our students and their compositions, be they alphabetic or otherwise, and helping them to develop and refine their rhetorical abilities as compositionists of their preferred modality. This means acknowledging, encouraging, and trying to understand the processes, products, and concepts they choose to explore through their self-sponsored, multimodal composing practices. Thank you for considering my argument. Please contact me if you are interested in the sources I consulted.